Today we're going to talk about political systems. This morning we're going to talk about political systems. Anything to do with politics, political, typically has to do with types of government. This chapter, this section is a lot of definitions. So you have cards. You can get these cards out and you can review your cards as we go through these. You can add information to each card. So the first one would be states. We typically refer to states as smaller geographic areas like Indiana, Ohio, but these fit this definition, right? Organizations that set up, governments are organizations that set up and enforce laws. And a state is an area that shares a government. Indiana has a government. The state government is in Indianapolis. These governments, the pictures here, have to do with, this one is an example of how the United States government is set up and functions. We have the Constitution, which sets up the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. This is from the United Kingdom. This is from Australia. This is from Russia. All of these different countries that we're familiar with have governments. States and nation states are the areas that are ruled by a government. So a state is a region that shares a government. Again, that could be Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, California. It could be the United States. As a country, we are a region that shares a government. We are an independent state. A nation state are states that are independent of other states. So a nation state is what we normally would call a country. So these are a little bit interchangeable. When we talk about like Mr. Tillerson, Rex Tillerson is the Secretary of State. He works for the federal government. He represents the state of the United States to the rest of the world. Dependencies are regions that belong to another state. So we've heard about Puerto Rico in the news due to the devastation from the recent hurricane. Puerto Rico is a dependency of the United States. They have a governor. They have their own government there. They are not a state like Indiana is, but they are a dependency of the United States. So they are looking towards the federal government for help in recovering from the hurricane. So how did states evolve? How did we come to be countries? And really, you can trace it back to ancient times. And if you go back to ancient Greece, this is kind of the building block for modern day countries. Ancient Greece, here's a map of ancient Greece. A city-state that we might be familiar with is Athens. Another one we might be familiar with, Corinth. That one's actually mentioned in the Bible. Sparta was over in this area. So Athens, Sparta, Corinth, little art there. But these city-states were all independent. So there was no Greek government during ancient Greece. There was just this idea that they were Greeks, that they shared a common ancestor, that they had a common language, that they had a common history. But the government of Athens was not responsible for the things that happened in Marathon. Marathon was not responsible for Corinth. These city-states sometimes went to war with one another because they were independent states. What happens then later in time is that an emperor takes control and unites these under his rule. So empires are states containing several countries, typically headed by an emperor who had great power. This is a picture of the Roman Empire. And so Rome started as a city-state right here through the rule of various emperors, which included Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. They expanded the empire to the point where it's completely surrounded the Mediterranean Sea. So this is an empire. So the city-states were the initial building blocks. You had individual communities that were responsible for themselves that all formed their own government. Eventually, you come to empire. Empires are hard to maintain, and after this empire breaks down, countries begin to form around 1000, 1200 AD. So today, within any one state, you can have a variety of rule. We have direct democracy, tribal rule, absolute monarchy, dictatorship, oligarchy, constitutional monarchy, and representative democracy. And what you should see is that a lot of governments combine pieces of this, but we'll start with the definitions. First definition is direct democracy. This is the earliest form of government. This is where all of the adults in the community are involved in the decisions. Ancient Athens is probably the best early example of a direct democracy. They believed that any able-bodied, sound-minded adult was able to take part in government decisions. They had an assembly that was made up of all of the citizens. They had a council which made more important decisions, and people served on that for a year, and they were just drawn by a lottery. And when it was your turn, you were on the council. You didn't really have a choice. So that's a direct democracy. Everybody's involved. If you think about the United States today, it's not possible for us to have a direct democracy. There is no place where all of the citizens, all of the adult citizens of the United States could come meet. It's just too many people. But it works well in a small town. And so there are small towns in New England. So you're talking Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, up in that area, that have town meetings where all of the adults can come and be involved. And so they still have direct democracy. Now, the government as a whole, the state government doesn't function in that way, but small towns can. Tribal rule. This doesn't really exist anymore anywhere. There are some pieces of it within countries in small communities in sub-Saharan Africa, some in Asia. But as far as governing a large region, this doesn't exist. So tribal rule, communities banded together into larger groups. Chiefs and elders made decisions based on the culture's customs and beliefs. Absolute monarchy does still exist today. It lasted until about 200 years ago, and the king or queen had absolute power. And power is hereditary. That's what makes a monarch, that they pass down rule to their children. When you think about the American Revolution at that time, forming our new government was completely unheard of. And everywhere in the world, they had kings and queens that were absolute monarchs. They didn't share power. England was supposed to share power, but they didn't, as far as the colonies go, they didn't share enough. So an absolute monarch is a king or queen that takes the throne through their family, and then they have absolute power over a country. A dictatorship, this is really more common than absolute monarchy. A dictatorship is where one person rules, and a leader who is not king or queen has absolute power. Examples would be Libya, Cuba, North Korea. North Korea is the one we hear in the news most often these days, with Kim Jong-un being the leader of that. He makes the decisions. He does not share power with a legislature or a judiciary that can limit him. He may have a legislature and judiciary, but they do what he wants them to do. Dictators typically seize power. For Kim Jong-un, it's his father, Kim Jong-il, who had seized power, and then when he died, his son took over. Oligarchy is a government controlled by small groups of people. China is an example of a modern-day oligarchy. They do have a president in China, but it's really the Communist Party, which is a political party that is in control of that country, and the leader is chosen from the ranks of the Communist Party. So there's no election, there's no choice by the people. Oligarchies will usually function like a dictatorship. A constitutional monarchy, the first thing you need to know is the word constitutional means limits. Whenever you see the word constitutional, it indicates that there are limits on the power. So a constitutional monarchy means there are limits on the power of the monarch. So the definition, the king or queen is limited by law. We have lots of modern day examples. The United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Sweden, Kuwait are all examples. There are more. The country of Jordan in the Middle East is a constitutional monarchy. These countries have a constitution. The definition I want you to have for constitution is framework for government. I do not like the definition that the book gives you. So you can go ahead and write down that a constitution is a framework for government. A constitution might be written, it might be unwritten, but either way, it sets up the structure of the government. And that structure is such that it limits the government's power. That's what makes a constitutional monarchy. A representative democracy is what we have today. Representative democracies are governments that are run by representatives chosen by the people. A constitutional monarchy can also be a representative democracy. So United States, Canada, India are representative democracies. This was a new idea. And so in our country, we credit this to James Madison. He's really the one who came and developed this idea that you take parts of a republic, you take parts of a democracy, and you blend them together. And so in the United States, we're too large to have a direct democracy. So we elect representatives who then represent us and make laws for us. If you have a constitutional monarchy that also has an elected legislature and elected leaders like the United Kingdom does, then it is a constitutional monarchy and representative democracy. International organizations exist. These international organizations like NATO, the United Nations, and the European Union work to improve life around the globe for citizens, for children. They work to keep peace. They work to enhance the economic well-being of their countries. And lastly, so when you look at different governments, really what we're looking at is the difference between absolute control and having no control. Governments like absolute monarchies are autocratic governments, oligarchies, dictatorships. So if we look at the difference between having a lot of control along this continuum to having no control, a country like North Korea would be over here, right? The government has a lot of control. The people have very little, and the people have little control. The government has all the power. They're definitely not in the situation where they have no control and the people have anarchy. Something like the United States would be closer here. The government doesn't have absolute control, but they also don't lack for power. We don't have chaos, and we don't live under an oppressive autocratic government. Most of the nations in the world are somewhere over here. Most of the countries that we view as dictatorships or autocratic governments are over here. We have some in the middle. Countries like Venezuela, Colombia, they have governors, they have presidents that are a little more powerful than we like. They're not quite over here, but they make decisions that kind of move the government closer to having absolute control. So keep in mind that this continuum, countries can change. So if there was a time where the Soviet Union, which is Russia, was definitely over here, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s. They had a leader named Mikhail Gorbachev who moved them all the way over here. But unfortunately, under their newest leader, or not even really new, he's been there about 10 years now, under Putin, they're moving back this way. They're not as absolute control as China or North Korea, but they're definitely not where they were under Mikhail Gorbachev and some of his successors.